So with that, we're going to move on to this next panel. It's sort of a blend of things. So we're going to start with Joe Melnik, who is going to talk about access to data. We've heard a lot about data and how everybody wants to see everybody else's data. How do you do it? Is it impossible? Or is there a pathway that we should be following? And then the rest of this panel is going to talk about probably the most important issue that we talk about here at the summit, and that we're going to talk about the rest of today. And that is the power of the voices of survivors of hate-fueled violence. Because I'm a lawyer, and in my business, we rely a lot on expert witnesses, people who have a unique insight into an issue. And though we would never, ever, ever wish it on them, the survivors of violence have an incredibly unique insight into so many aspects of this field. And the summit is 1,000% committed to ensuring that the voices of survivors are embedded in everything we do, from prevention to response to the judicial system. And having spent a lot of time traveling with survivors to Brett's conference in Canada, to Rishi's event in Liverpool, to the United Nations, I will tell you this. It is the voices of those survivors that riveted all of those people that were sitting at the United Nations. It was the power of a survivor, Michelle Rosenthal, who captivated Alison Deritu, one of the most significant people at the United Nations. It is those voices that tell the story of why we are all doing this work. And so you're going to hear some people talking about what we have underway to embed those voices of survivors. But before we get to them, we're going to have just a very quick moment on data. Joe.
Very quick. Thank you. So I'm one of the co-chairs of the working group focusing on facilitating access to data. And to answer Laura's question, no, it's not impossible to get access to data. Our group is looking at, quite frankly, making more data, or ways that we can make more data available to more researchers and other companies that are out there looking to do analysis and unlock the insights and actionable intelligence from the data that sometimes, quite frankly, is hidden in plain sight. Our work is both ambitious and practical. We are looking to identify broadly all of the various types of data sources and data sets that are out there that could be useful for the work that's being done. Whether those data sources are sitting at companies, tech companies, online companies, other types of companies, governmental entities, or publicly available. Whether it's historical data, real-time data, quantitative data, qualitative data, we're really looking at it with a broad lens. Each of those presents different types of challenges and different types of complexities. So we are also looking at coming up with a set of best practices that will enable data sources to get comfortable making their data available and understand the incentives and realize the incentives of making that data available, and data users, which are the researchers and the companies that are using it for actionable items, being able to have best practices to avoid mishandling data, utilizing data in a way that furthers their goals, and also be able to present themselves to the data sources as a trusted user of the data to facilitate better and more access to the data. We have a breakout session on Friday morning. We're a great group, even though I'm the only one sitting up here. I encourage everybody to show up. We're a lot of fun. So come one, come all.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Laura, Michelle, and everyone who has worked tirelessly to make this an impactful event a reality. I'd like to acknowledge my staunchly dedicated survivor co-chair, the Mrs. Dawn Collins, and all of the brave survivors for your irreplaceable contributions to this effort. Allow me to say to all of you how encouraging it is for survivors to look out at so many experts across so many disciplines raising your voices against hate. But let us be ever mindful that at the heart of why we are all here are the heartbeats that were suddenly silenced far too soon. But know that they are still with us. They were with us, crying out on the floor of the United Nations, thanking the sports world, the sports working group, for raising the powerful voices of the sports world against hate. They were with us as we crossed the pond to Liverpool football. Their chants for peace echoed off the green monster in Fenway, all the way to Ottawa Summit and back home here in Pittsburgh to hold their loved ones up, who are both burdened and blessed, to add a face to the unimaginable complex grief while giving voice to the thousands of survivors who otherwise may never be heard, save for the efforts that we collectively as a working group can manifest here. Being a new working group, we offer one powerful example: a survivor's guide, a mobile app that helps to prepare our newest reluctant members for what they must endure as they enter the new family of pain, resilience, and recovery. Let them be greeted with dignity and compassion, devoid of the traumatization effects of policies that may be required, but lose sight of the empathy that survivors so desperately deserve. A guide that assists law enforcement and all those in charge with reaching out, that first contact, who by no fault of their own, they reach people who find themselves in the worst possible place in their lives. A guide with intuitive information that helps survivors find their way back from the debilitating abyss of grief and despair. I could go on, but in interest of time and the very important people to follow, I would just like to end by saying this: Mom, Lieutenant Collins, the worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue and in the prayer service in Charleston, to the babies of Uvalde. They are with you, and so are we, their families. Every bit as crucial to this fight as anything you will find in the data or a lab. We are living evidence that this can no longer, we as survivors can no longer be overlooked. Please acknowledge the contribution and accept it and embrace it. Thank you. That's it.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Binkley, and yesterday morning I boarded a flight from Atlanta to Pittsburgh. Consider this not merely a trip, but the leg of a journey. A journey that began almost 5 years ago, November 2nd, in Tallahassee, Florida, where my daughter Maura, then a senior at Florida State University, lost her life shooting at a yoga studio. Dr. Nancy Van Vessem, a medical school professor at Florida State, also lost her life. 4 other women were wounded. Perpetrator was a member of misogynistic incel subculture, best I can characterize it. Maura and the other victims were shot for no other reason than being women. In the aftermath of this tragedy, my wife Margaret and I, my late wife now, Margaret and I, founded Maura's Voice Research Fund at Florida State University, working with faculty of the School of Social Work, College of Social Work, the School of Criminology, their grad students, undergraduate interns from Tri Delta, Maura's sorority, to address issues at the intersection of hatred and violence in our society, with the focus on the prevention of violence against women and girls. So that journey to Tallahassee, to the site of this tragic event, one further manifestation of violent hatred in our society, which occurred 6 days after the shooting here at Tree of Life. 6 days after. That journey brought me here last year to Eradicate Hate Conference. I met so many able and dedicated people dedicated to this same cause of eradicating hatred, hate-fueled violence, and made connections. And those connections resulted in the advancement of our work. Specifically, Maura's Voice Research Fund is now partnering with the Anti-Defamation League to support their first ever fully dedicated researcher to the area of misogyny, manosphere, and incel subculture. Also, with the ADL, they are funding, and we are otherwise supporting with intern assistance the postgraduate work of recent PhD Chris Collins, and I think he's somebody you'll hear a lot about. We think his research into behavioral aspects of the incel subculture and the use of threat assessment science to increase our ability to identify and, to the degree possible, predict and interdict against the behavior of violent incels. And that would not have happened, even though we had worked with ADL on some policy issues in Florida and Georgia around hate crimes legislation. That would not have happened if I hadn't been here, if my journey had not brought me here last year. Something else, and I don't think I've even told many people this, maybe nobody here, but in 5 weeks, my journey will take me back to Tallahassee. I'm there frequently, but it's the next time it will take me back. And on November 2nd, 5 years from the day of the Tallahassee yoga shooting, the Maura's Voice Research Fund, College of Social Work, Office of the Provost, FSU Student Senate, and Tri-Delta will be sponsoring a symposium, policy symposium on hate crimes. Also, there will be a memorial service that evening on Landis Green on the FSU campus. Now, Landis Green is where the memorial service was held on November 3rd, 2018, for Maura and the other victims. 5 days before that, my daughter attended memorial service at that same location for the victims of Tree of Life here in Pittsburgh. So I guess I was a part of this community before I ever knew I was. So I'd say to you, your journeys have brought you here. Embrace the power of a common cause. Embrace the power of connection. And embrace the power of eradicate hate. Thank you.
I think we have one remote participant and then a final speaker.
Oh, hi. I am so sorry. I did not realize that I am the remote participant. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Izar. I'm the head of the United Nations Victims of Terrorism Unit, which is part of the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism. And I'm very pleased to be part of this summit, which I have found incredibly interesting and incredibly relevant to the work that we do. And I apologize for not having been able to join live, but now I am going to make a very brief introduction, as I was asked to do, about how the United Nations system has prioritized, increasingly so, over the last decade and a half, the voices of victims and survivors of terrorism as critical to prevention and peace-building efforts. And this is reflected to the growth of the program that I lead, which is the Global Victims of Terrorism Support Program. So I'm gonna be going through just like a very brief history of how the global landscape of terrorism has changed the way that we perceive and involve victims and survivors in our work as the United Nations. I have to agree with some of the points that have been made about how having victims and survivors on stage, hearing their stories, and having their narrative be at the center is a lot more powerful than much of the policy and of the documents that the intergovernmental two entities at the UN can actually produce. So I want to highlight some of the main milestones in the evolution of these victims and survivors international agenda. The first point at which we started seeing victims and survivors highlighted by the United Nations system was with the adoption of the global counter-terrorism strategy that brought an increased focus on supporting victims. This happened in 2006, and this strategy was adopted by the General Assembly with the recommendation that it be reviewed every 2 years. Then the next milestone, after consecutive reviews of the global counterterrorism strategy, came when the General Assembly designated the 21st of August as International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. This happened in 2017, and this is a commemoration that we, as the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, lead every year. This 21st of August that just passed was the 6th commemoration, and this marked a shift in the kind of support that was provided to victims and recognized the importance of memorialization and remembrance for victims and survivors and their communities, but also for general audiences as an educational and awareness-raising tool, so that they could understand the life-changing and altering impact of terrorism. And the way that we do it increasingly is through highlighting the victims themselves and giving them a platform to tell their stories themselves. And I'll speak about that in a moment. Subsequently, my office, the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, was also created in 2017. And just shortly after, the first iteration of the program that I lead, the Global Victims of Terrorism Support Program, was created in 2018. The program has expanded over the years and has contributed to the development of a few very interesting bodies of policy, but also to the establishment of the Group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, which happened in 2019. This is a group of like-minded member states that is co-chaired at the moment by Iraq and Spain, and puts the emphasis on holistically promoting the rights of victims of terrorism at the international level, and meeting their lifelong needs. So this group is composed of 38 member states at the moment, and was instrumental in the adoption of the first General Assembly resolution, also in 2019, specifically on victims and survivors. Now, fast forward to just 2020, and a few reviews of the of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, the GCTS, and member states started recognizing the importance of victim voices and the importance of victim-centric approaches. Why? Because they understood that to really put in place not only systems of support, but to create resilient communities and to entrench a culture of embedded, systematic, victim-centric approaches was a critical peace-building activity that also contributed to prevention and to mitigation of risks of violent extremism and also terrorism. So they started seeing it as well as a prevention strategy, which then takes us to these days. Last year, the first United Nations Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism was the first time that we were able to bring together high-level officials. We had 400 participants from member states at parliamentary and high levels, with victims and survivors themselves, who issued a call to action at the General Assembly of the United Nations, with civil society and the private sector to discuss matters important to victims of terrorism through victims themselves, who voiced what was important for them and what their needs were. These thematic areas that were actually understood in consultation with victims and victims associations included access to justice, reparations, remembrance and recognition, and focusing on more tailored issues, such as the matter of cross-border victims, victims of conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of terrorism, and children and youth as victims of terrorism. So this was a pivotal moment in which as well we were able, through one of the 4 pillars of the global program on victims of terrorism of the United Nations, focuses on communications and visibility, which means that we bring victims to tell their stories through audiovisual products and campaigns, most recently through a project that we launched that is highly relevant to this panel session, which we launched on the occasion of the 6th International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. And this is the Legacy Project, which aims to highlight via an Instagram gallery the transformational journeys of victims and survivors told by themselves and how they want to contribute positively to society by using their stories as powerful deterrents and powerful education and historical memory of how detrimental the impact is of terrorist attacks and violent extremism and hatred. So this also took us to this year, when we actually dedicated the first United Nations Victims of Terrorism Solidarity Tree at the Gardens of United Nations headquarters. Also an occasion in which victims and survivors spoke about their experiences and spoke about the importance of having symbols and memorialization and remembrance opportunities. So all of this is for us a way of covering very important aspects. One of them is, as I said, the aspect of community resilience, the aspect of having a victims and survivors community that feels seen and validated by the international community, who feel their stories make a difference and that their needs are properly addressed by the United Nations and by their member states. So the creation of platforms, and I thank very much the organizers of this summit for having us, because this is a very important platform to do just that, is basically what fuels the growth of our program and the growth of what has been the International Victims of Terrorism agenda at the United Nations. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Ciardelli. I am the co-chair of the working group, which is the Voices of Survivors of Modern Day Hate. And I have to say that I'm humbled to be on the stage with Raymond and Jeff. And I just reaffirm what I think everyone in this room feels, is that we stand in solidarity with you and with others who have experienced such loss, as we try, I think, to think about how we honor those victims' voices and the survivors' voices in ways that maintain dignity, in ways that maintain meaning, and ways that are always done respectfully. So at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is where I'm situated, I've been there since 2008. Of course, it's our nation's memorial to the event of the Holocaust, and we're a memorial first and foremost, and we believe that memorializing can be done through education, that it's a real form of memorialization to educate, and that we know we can best honor the victims if we remember these events and work to prevent, which is obviously what I think unites us here. A through line through all of this is, through our educational endeavor, are the human stories. And I think the human stories always remind us of the truth of the events, the undeniability of the events, that these events have happened, and they're always a through line of humanity in the midst of the inhumanity. The working group, which is seeking to capture, to convey, to preserve these stories of victims of modern day hate, are looking to learn from experiences of the field of teaching and learning about the Holocaust that has had decades of thinking about how to preserve these voices, and also so many other recent endeavors that are looking to honor voices in ways that maintain dignity, in ways that also do not continue to cause trauma through live retellings. There's a toll that comes with reliving these really traumatic moments. So we recognize and value the personal testimony, which is such a valuable resource because it impacts educational settings, and I've seen this in the work at the museum. We've all seen this. We've all experienced it. When we hear these stories, it opens minds. Those stories open dialogue. So the value of thinking about this collection is pretty key. The working group is going to have a session this afternoon at 3:30, and I'd say we're in a discovery phase. We're really looking to define recommendations for what a perhaps tiered collection of these voices might look like, in trying to understand how we do it, what a project structure might look like, how we draw on relevant research, how we draw on relevant existing testimony, and again, how we do it in a way that is that's trauma-informed, that's respectful, that's dignified, and that is meaningful, that we've got a real understanding of the purpose of how these voices can be shared. I know for myself, working at the museum, one of the greatest privileges has been the opportunities to engage with survivors who, again, come and relive these most tragic moments, but do it in a way where I've repeatedly seen hearts and minds open and conversations open and people just thinking differently about issues. So that's the power of this. But none of these individuals chose to be in those positions, right? Nobody has chosen to experience the hate-fueled violence that created a new reality. So I really feel that all of us have an obligation to be so thoughtful about working in a manner that's respectful, that's thoughtful, and that really contributes to positive change. And so that's our working group. We'll be meeting at 3:30. And again, it's just an honor and a privilege to be thinking about how to do this well. So thank you.